You started this at the age of 24. How did you have this global vision at that young age? What drove you to it?
My degree is actually in social work, so I'm not a crafter or a business person, but really came at it through the lens of impact. And I think the idea of giving small amounts of credit or lending to what would be considered unbankable women previously. So poor women in emerging markets. And it started scaling as this idea. And it was obviously 18 years ago, and these other elements that felt essential for a woman, especially a woman maybe in a rural setting and in a global community, to really be successful and thrive.
Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. This is Peak Performance Perspective for Entrepreneurs. Let me start out by asking, what does peak performance mean to you as an entrepreneur?
I think I love being an entrepreneur, but I'm a social entrepreneur. So to me, peak performance is really about driving global impact and making sure that the work we're doing is successful for Nest as an organization, but that it's driving impact and performance for all of our beneficiaries, which are artisans and makers around the world.
Love it. Just to give our audience a little bit of understanding, what is Nest all about?
I founded it 18 years ago. That dates me a long time, and we support the world of creative entrepreneurship. So artisans, makers, artists in the US and globally, and really recognizing that they come to their work as talented artists, but often the business side of it, the micro and small business side of it, is something they're learning on the go. They're wearing many hats, and they can bring their talent, and we try to help provide pro bono assistance, whether that's business education or financing or market building, to really help them turn that creative talent into a thriving smaller micro business.
Talking of Nest, you started this at the age of 24. How did you have this global vision at that young age? What drove you to it?
My degree is actually in social work, so I'm not a crafter or a business person, but really came at it through the lens of impact. And at the time that I was getting my degree, Muhammad Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize for microfinance. And I think, which is the idea of giving small amounts of credit or lending to what would be considered unbankable women previously. So poor women in emerging markets. And it started scaling as this idea. And it was obviously 18 years ago. So it was the early days of kind of social business and doing good with business. And so I was intrigued by the idea, as many others were, but in our country, a small loan is debt. It's not a business. And so I was really interested in that model, but in pairing it with more holistic business support. How do we not just provide capital, but how do we also provide business education, market building, and these other elements that felt essential for a woman, especially a woman maybe in a rural setting and in a global community, to really be successful and thrive. And so 18 years ago, that was its mission. And while it's evolved a lot, it more or less is still true today about what we do.
Yeah, obviously, Muhammad Yunus wins the Nobel Prize. You're young, you're looking for opportunities, you want to create impact, you see something, you're like, oh, there's something here, right? But you could have done many other things. Was there any emotional reason that drove you to this cause?
Sure. You're like getting right into it. I have a family of entrepreneurs, and my dad was an entrepreneur. There's 5 other people in my family who have started nonprofits. So social entrepreneurship in particular. And obviously I was like surrounded by people who have decided to do that, and I could look to for advice and feedback. And the school where I graduated, Washington University in St. Louis, actually had a business plan competition for nonprofits, and I applied for it and won. And so that gave me seed capital to start. It was only $25,000, but 18 years ago in St. Louis, Missouri, that was enough to be off to the races. And when I was young, and so I was able to take those risks. I like to tell people that the year I started Nest was actually the same year that Etsy was founded. And so if you think back in our ethos, pre the world of Etsy, like people weren't talking about the handmade or local or made local or like any of these things that are now so richly a part of the consumer landscape. Every company now has ways that they support the handmade economy, and even Amazon has Amazon Handmade, which you wouldn't have imagined like a myth like Amazon investing in this sector before. So much has changed. It was a lot of grit and hard work, but it was like an equal dose of luck that the consumer landscape really trended in our favor as I started.
Wow. Craft-based work is a major source of employment for women globally. And you are so close to it, and you have been in this world for so long. Tell us a little bit about what are some specific challenges these women face and what Nest has done to be able to help them overcome it?
I think the hand, like as companies really wanted to invest in handmade, as that consumer demand really started increasing, there was like a few things that really jumped out as being barriers. One was transparency. Most craft work happens in homes. It's not inside regulated factories. So as larger companies wanted to invest and buy from handmade artisans, they didn't have like transparency. Like you could go to a factory and audit it to ensure their well-being. But if it's made by a cottage industry of a whole bunch of women in a village in Rwanda, each making baskets in their home, how does a company like West Elm have visibility into that? And so we actually put together, West Elm was actually our first partner, which is why I mentioned them, because they were really looking to really boost and invest in handmade. And so we put together this group of brands and retailers, but Target, The Children's Place, Calvin Klein, the PVH family of brands. And we all spent the better part of 2 years writing and piloting a standard for how companies could have transparency in a home-based workforce. And we ended up doing it in partnership with the United Nations and launched it at the UN, which has now been adopted by many companies. So it's, that was sort of one of the first big hurdles. A lot of companies were like, we can't work with artisans because they're in the home. And we've just been trying to systematically solve all of the reasons why companies maybe couldn't support these women. And that was a big one. But then, and it's for artisans, but it's also, I think many consumers, you and I, don't even realize how much our day-to-day consumption is made by women in their homes, putting tiny seed beads on jewelry that you buy at a mass market retailer. We've been in homes where they're sewing the palm on top of a winter hat or the sole on a shoe. So it's not just true artisanal talent. It's also just anything that's kind of handwork. And so the scale and scope of kind of the number of women that are working in their homes and need this kind of visibility was much bigger than I think we originally anticipated.
Yeah, not only you're giving female handworkers visibility, but there's a whole idea of gender equity here, right? So working so close with such communities, like what are you noticing? How are their immediate communities changing because of you're empowering female artisans to be able to now work and bring money in? What are some stories that you have from that realm?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're like hitting the nail on the head, which was that like home-based work it's women, and it's because they're caring for their family. Maybe gender discrimination is still strong in their community, and so they need to work at home versus in an outside factory where they'd be commuting to work. And we feel really strongly that type of work has to be allowed within major supply chains. And for a long time, there's actually been a standard in the industry that is where companies have what's called a no home worker policy, where they say that if they find out that their work is happening in a home, they pull production. So the woman loses her job essentially, and they move it to a factory or they move it to a different country, a different place where they could have it done. And so we've been like fiercely saying that's like in my dream, that would be like a CEO saying they have an anti-woman policy. Like, how can you have a policy like that? And so really trying to change the tide on some of these conversations. Obviously, I think then a global pandemic happens, it sends us all home. And I think the tides are starting to turn, but I think we feel really strongly that home-based work is super important for women. And we have lots of stories of women that's been true. And when they earn a more consistent income, a fairer wage, they're able to invest it into their children. They buy insurance for the first time. They have resilient income when things go wrong. And so it's just, we have so many stories, and I could talk a lot about it, but we'll see where we want to go.
Consistent income during the tough times, fair wage, companies having these crazy policies that you can't work from home. What are some other challenges that remain? Because there is such little visibility into this world. As you said, I go on Amazon and I want to buy some beads for my wife, and I do. I don't care who's making it. I have no idea who's making it. So as a consumer, we are so uneducated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we also found in the world of, there are so many challenges, and so maybe we can talk about a few of them, but home-based work in many countries, it's actually legal to not pay a minimum wage because it's considered like women's work or supplemental work. And so there are actually some countries where you as a company are like legally sound if you don't pay minimum wage for the work that's happening, which is like just crazy, and why we had to write this standard and really hold companies to a level above legal regulation in some cases. But I think quality and consistency, obviously when you're home-based, producing, many women in a factory can all see the same thing. They're producing the same thing when you're in your your home, you don't necessarily have visibility into the rest of the production. And so companies that want every single thing to look exactly the same, that can be challenging in a cottage industry format. I think it's also hard if you're like an artist cooperative to make those market connections. Like you're lucky if you're getting those orders, but if you're a cooperative working in a rural location, how are you building those relationships in the first place to be able to scale your work? While we have the transparency program and we have a bunch of retailers, we also we're a nonprofit and we raise philanthropy to really help invest in artisan businesses to boost their skills in that regard. How do they build better production systems? How do they market and be able to build stronger brand connections? And so really helping, which is why we really try to take a holistic look at what an artisan business might need, transparency being one. But as you mentioned, definitely not the only one.
Yeah, governmental regulations about not wanting to pay minimum wage, companies not wanting to hire home-based workers, cultural context problems, right? You're literally the David taking on the Goliath. Another seasoning on the challenges that you're facing. Nest programs are offered at no cost to artisans. So how are you going about securing funding and partnerships to sustain these initiatives?
We definitely feel like David versus Goliath. And I'm like a social worker from Missouri. So sometimes when we like work with these companies, we're like writing this standard at the United Nations. I'm like, how in the world am I being allowed to do this? I'm a social worker from Missouri. But anyway, that's some imposter syndrome we can talk about later. But I think our model, we are a nonprofit. So we raise philanthropy from individuals who care a lot about our cause, from foundations. And then we also partner with brands and retailers who support our efforts and or hire us to help them support artisans and makers, whether that's through our ethical handcraft program or helping them source new product. We haven't talked about this yet, but we have a huge program in the United States called Makers United, which is really investing in diverse makers around the United States. And so we help companies build programs to work with small makers, whether it's kind of drop ship or local pop-ups or licensing. So how kind of small, very small single makers and artists can collaborate with much larger companies. We're really interested in helping with that, unlock in ways that feel ethical and aligned with the artist goals. So we have dual revenue where we're getting some money from philanthropy and then some from our corporate partners as we build partnerships.
Obviously, all of the work, majority of the work is in the craft industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you must have really strong feelings and belief systems associated with craft. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's so much about craft that feels like obviously it's a form of livelihood, but it also is deeply personal. I don't think you'll meet anyone that doesn't have a connection to craft in their family, whether it was their grandmother who was a sewer or their great grandfather was a cobbler. Everyone's connected to it in some way. And there's not a place on earth where craft doesn't exist, which I think is also amazing. And we're looking at a time in our world where between kind of climate change and war and conflict, displacement is at its highest levels. And refugees and immigrants, they take their craft with them. It's their connection to their home and to their place and to their community and culture. And craft is not only livelihood for so many, it's life and it's there. And so how we invest in it feels even more important than just putting bread on the table, which is obviously mission enough. But when you add on these other complexities of it really being so deeply tied to family legacy, to generational storytelling, to culture, it takes on a new meaning.
Your initiatives, the work that you're doing, helping provide food on the table for some of these families in different countries where God knows if you weren't there and your organization wasn't there, what the standards would be, right? As consumers, we don't know where these things are being made. They're being made, brought somewhere for pennies on the dollar. We're paying a certain amount of money, and that is now helping them, right? Through whatever marketplace they were buying it. How is craft work in America working out in comparison to craft work in other countries? What are some similarities? What are some dissimilarities that you're noticing?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest differences is the kind of size of the operation. In the US, it's almost always just a solopreneur. Maybe they have one or two people, but it's often just a woman or a man doing their craft, maybe in their garage or in their basement, or so that globally, it's often cooperative. So it is individual women, but they're coming together in cooperative models, which doesn't really have a parallel in the United States right now. We don't really have a business model that you could form as a corporation that's a cooperative. And in other countries, there actually is a formal structure for that. And so I think that's a big difference, is that in the US, you're working with individuals mostly, and globally, you're working often with entire businesses or of many individuals. So scale can be really different, and how you think about scale can be really different, especially as you think about kind of corporate partnerships for those individuals. But I think often it's really the same, which is that they come with a passion and a heart for the craft and the art, and the business is secondary to them. They're artists, and the skills that they need to gain are often super related. I'd say in the US, we also have noticed that there's a huge financing gap, that there's very little financing or investment dollars for craft or art-based businesses. It's been devalued as a sector, not really seen as investable as others. And so we've really tried to step into not just business education, but also small scale financing to help some of these businesses grow.
If we haven't covered enough challenges in this industry, let's bring another one, because I'm curious. Different countries, different government, political unrest, climate related disasters. How are you supporting people at the grassroots level to get through this?
I think one of the things, it's so true. I think we're like globally in this time of change, and I think we all feel that. And one of the things, so we have this global network. So if you're an artist in business anywhere in the world, you can apply to join. We call it our guild, and it's free of charge. And so we have thousands of enterprises in over 120 countries. And one of the things that like very large network allows us to do is to understand the sector as a whole. And so we can aggregate solutions that are happening on the ground, localized, grassroots, individual-led solutions, and share them so they can be resourced across this broad network. So how can we learn about how people are tackling climate change and raw material sourcing, and then share that with everybody else in the network so that people aren't working in isolation, they can learn from each other, they can connect with each other. So a lot of what we do is peer connection. But I think it's really true. I think that we're talking a lot about challenges. On the opportunity side, I think one of the things we're seeing right now because of all the chaos is a lot of division. People are, especially in our own country, but globally, there's just so much division. And I think we feel really lucky that craft is really a unifier. There's not one party that embraces it. Everybody embraces it. It's in everyone's culture and community. And so we feel really strongly that it's one of the few places these days that feels like it brings everyone together and everyone can understand and appreciate the value and want to support it. And we're really hoping that like craft and the art and our artists can play a really important role, not just in our future, but in storytelling a new future and helping bring people together to solve some of our global challenges.
100%. If there was one thing that we could rely on that people would fight least about, it's going to be craft and arts. Right? I think everything else, there's something divisive enough for people to start taking sides. Let's talk about Rebecca, the entrepreneur, Rebecca, the person. You have taken on a major project at a very young age. How do you balance life and all of this?
I think some people might say not very well, but I do try. I have 2 kids, but I think one of the things I really love is it may be that some people won't agree with me, but I really love that that balance isn't necessarily what I'm seeking. I really want my kids to see me work really hard and see the impact I'm having and be a part of that. And I remember as a little kid, my dad I said he was an entrepreneur, and I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd find him working, but he wasn't upset about it. He was happy. He was enthusiastic. It was him at his best. And I remember just loving being around him at that time. And I think when I look back at friends who had parents that were overworked, they were unhappy with their work. They saw it as work. And what I saw was just this passion, this like fuel that came from working. And so I always knew I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was little, but I always knew I wanted to love it. And I wanted my kids to see me love it. And I think so for me, I worry a lot less about balance and more about making sure that the things that I'm doing feel meaningful, both to me personally, but also to the world, and that my kids get to participate in that and see that. And I guess I would say that I don't really try too hard to have balance. And I think that the biggest thing to me is that like my kids see me being happy and productive. And I think even if that means I'm working a little too hard, I think there's been a lot of studies that like kids, they don't mind, it's not the long hours that kids mind. It's whether you're present and attentive with them when you're there. And I've really embraced that as a parent. So I'm not very balanced, but I try to make sure that there's balance in my day in terms of like the things I really feel fueled by, and then the things that you just have to do, the actual quote unquote work of it. And then I think I'm also a little biased because I work in the craft sector. And so I'm around artists and art and beauty all the time, which is also incredibly inspiring.
This is a podcast for entrepreneurs, and those who listen to it are trying to live that holistic life where there is mental health, physical health, successful business, while maintaining good, meaningful, deep relationships in life. Because so many of us as entrepreneurs, when we start a project, when we start our business, we pour ourselves into it because it's a game of survival in the very beginning, right?
Yes.
And when we are so focused on the game of survival, almost always we lose sight of something, right? But let's go back to what you just said a little bit ago about you didn't know what you wanted to do, but you knew that I wanted to do something that would fulfill me, that'll make me happy. This is like the quintessential entrepreneur problem, right? Everybody wants to do something that's fulfilling. They can never find it, or at least it feels like they can never find it. In a parallel universe where Muhammad Hussein didn't win the Nobel Prize and there wasn't a competition that he won $25,000, knowing what you know now, because you may not have known at that time. Knowing what you know now, if you had to go on a purpose-driven business idea journey, like a search journey, what would you have done?
I want to put a pin in the fact that entrepreneurship is in survival at the beginning. I'm like 18 years in and feel like I'm still playing that game of survival. So I'm pretty sure that might just be like for entrepreneurship period, maybe not just at the beginning. I think if I had to go back, one of the things I'm also really interested in, and I think there's been growing conversations around, are ideas of like entrepreneurship and how do you take a lot of the incredible assets of entrepreneurship, the creative thinking, the innovation, like all of those kind of elements, the passion, and bring them inside of organizations and companies too. And so I think I did end up starting my own thing and it did end up working out, but I think that there's benefit and joy and inspiration to come from being an entrepreneur and really finding a place where you want to make change. I look at a lot of our corporate partners and the people that are working there are fighting against, nebulous, hard supply chains, downward pressure on prices, like this, like consumer fuel to have things fast and cheap. And they're fighting the good fight every day. They're trying to make it different. They're trying to build impact within these companies. And it's so inspiring too. I think it's about finding that point of purpose. And it might be an entrepreneurship, but it might be leveraging that same fuel that comes with entrepreneurship in a different way. And how do we think about entrepreneurship in ways that doesn't just mean your own organization, your own business, but could mean a new program or a new initiative or pulling together people in new ways within existing enterprises too.
Yeah, you said my business ended up working out. I would think it did a little bit better than working out. Maybe being too humble. When anybody starts a business, right, you're a genius with 1,000 hands because you have to do everything. You have to figure out all of these things. But once the business has gone to a certain level, you start hiring people, right? And you almost always start hiring people in areas that you're not really great at or you don't want to do, right? Which then brings us to the next fact, which is that every entrepreneur has a genius zone. What would you say is your genius zone?
I love fundraising and partnership building. So I really love bringing money and partners into the mission that we have at the organization. That really fuels me. Finding creatives to inspire people to use their resources for good is something that really fuels me. So that has remained. And I think you're so spot on. I think there's like this kind of small part of you that like, you want to hire people that are like you. And it's, no, hire people that are exactly not like you to do all the things that you're exactly not good at. And so you like have to fight this temptation to one like-minded people to join. It's no, I need the accountants. Like I need all the other skills. I think you're so spot on. I also think like in the beginning when you're surviving, I think there's a major change that happens, which is where we are now, which is that there's like reflection that needs to happen. That it takes different skills to sustain and grow a business than it does to start one. It's a different viewpoint. And I think for an entrepreneur, that kind of constant inner dialogue and reflection about what is my role in how do I supplement with other staff to take over things to make sure that, because I think we get criticized all the time that we still feel like a new enterprise, even though we're 18 years old. And I think that's a lot because I'm still at the helm. So I'm like constantly coming up with like new ideas as opposed to if I transitioned authority and we just steadied on. So there's like some debate about that maybe on our board, but I think it is true that entrepreneurs have to think about that and like the culture that we're setting and how we think about growth versus launch.
If your genius zone is fundraising and bringing money into the organization, everybody listening to this is saying, I don't know how to do that. That's most people not good at. So what are some tips you would give to entrepreneurs so that just some basics, some things that you've learned over the years, like here's step by step what you need to do to be able to get going with this?
I think one of the things I like, someone said this to me really early on, which was because I was struggling with it at the very beginning, because when you're an entrepreneur, it feels really personal. To me, Nest is so personal. If someone doesn't insult Nest, but if there's a critique of Nest, I take it so deeply personally. I have to like take a moment and be like, that was about the business. It wasn't about me personally. It's really hard. And so when you're fundraising or looking for investment dollars early on as an entrepreneur, even later on as an entrepreneur, it feels so deeply personal that what you're asking for. And I had to create this like framework shift in my head where I'm not asking people to give money to me. I'm asking people to give money to this really important mission. And that shift in my head was, it sounds obvious, but in reality, you're just, as an entrepreneur, you're just so intimately tied to things that everything feels personal. And so really being able to shift a narrative in my head that I was raising money for this very specific mission and cause that could bring them value was such an unlock, because I could just like take myself out of it a little bit, which has really helped me, but is really hard to do as an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Almost always, we all intrinsically know the logical steps that we need to take to go from point A to point B, but it's always our mindset that becomes a barrier or makes things more difficult than they need to be. And coming up with frameworks like that helps us overcome that.
Absolutely. I'm also like a huge, just being more like concrete and practical, I'm a huge list maker. I'm like a huge fan of making lists. Someone once told me that the difference between a visionary and an entrepreneur is that an entrepreneur like looks at the mountains and then looks down at their sheet of paper and writes what they have to do next. And is you don't get lost in the vision. You like operationalize it. And I think that's been so true for me, that it's, yes, we want to have this big, massive global change. What do I do today to get there? And then 18 years later, you've walked many miles. And so I think that it's similar, but how you start building the practice of it.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. That looking at the bigger vision and then breaking it down into smaller steps. How small do you make your step? Is it on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis? How do you form your goals?
All of the above, but mostly daily. And honestly, I think it's really important for it to be really micro. I'm often at, we have a strategic plan, but I think so much of our success has been that we've been willing to be responsive to the situation around us. The world is changing so fast and in so many ways we can't anticipate that I feel like there's more of a danger of us becoming wedded to a 5-year plan. Pandemic happens, or climate change is shifting things so quickly. AI, robotics, technology, like craft is going to completely change. So I really want to make sure we stay grounded in what we're seeing around us on a really regular basis. So we have a strategic plan, we have a 5-year vision, but I'm really like constantly talk to the team about the fact that, and we will pivot that vision on a dime if we feel like our stakeholders need us to. And so we have a roadmap, but daily, weekly, monthly, annually, we're reflecting on it. And is this still the right path forward?
How do you not let the minutia of daily life derail you? Because for an entrepreneur, there's so many things that are happening on a daily basis. It's like a game of hot potato, right? You're almost always behind on everything. It's just how behind you're on something sometimes is the focus of today. But over time, that builds up, that accumulates. Almost always, we want to tackle that with more work, more hours, which results to burnout, right? So what are some best practices that you have or learned or taught yourself avoid the minutia of life?
That's such a good question. I'm not sure I've ever like deliberately reflected on it, but now I'm going to. But I think it is important to have like specific times where you zoom out, and we have leadership retreats where we get together as a group of leaders and we do return back to the vision. You can't avoid, it's not one or the other. You do have to come up with a way to have parallel vision where you're looking down and up at the same time, which can be overwhelming. And so I think making sure that you have carved out deliberate time to do it is super important, because the daily task can just become all consuming, and they're just constantly as a fire to put out. And the strategy meetings can get pushed every day if you let them. And so making sure that you're fierce about some of those elements, I think is super important. But it's a great point, because I think mostly, I guess I've been doing it a little intuitively, but it's a challenge and a really very real one.
You've been doing this for 10 years, right? And you're wildly successful at it. You're still very passionate about it. But like I said before, you could have done anything else. And every single day of the 8 years that you have lived in this world, you're encountering new things. There has to be have had so many moments where you're like, that is so tempting. That is so tempting. Yeah, Nest is in a good place. Maybe I just hand it to somebody else and do something else, right? How do you continue to stay motivated and inspired in this business? Or let's be truthful, are there times when you wander?
Oh, every day I want to. At some point in the day, every day I want to. And there's a lot more times I don't, but it's every day. There's moments where it's like, oh, this is hard. But there's an equal number of moments that are not. And I think, especially when you're a social entrepreneur, there's so many stories of impact that we have, and many meaningful we work in a small community in Alabama that is Black quilters, and the average income in the community when we first started working there was $16,000 a year. It was just true poverty even in our country. And they make these, it's called the G-Spin quilters, and they make these incredibly iconic, beautiful modern quilts. And they never had access to e-commerce. It's like, what, 2024? And they weren't selling these incredible quilts online. And so you just have to happen into the community to buy one. And we launched them in a partnership with Etsy where they waived the fees. And so the quilters were making all of the revenue from it, and then did a series of other collaborations with these quilters, and have brought in over $1 million of direct revenue in 2.5 years to these quilters, which is just so incredible. And there's just so many stories like that where it was just a small unlock, like being able to sell online. Like that's not rocket science. That's just sort of basic stuff. And it's had massive impact. And so there are so many hard times, and then there are so many times that it just takes your breath away, the work. And like I keep photos and little stories and little post-it notes so that like the moments that you're grinding your teeth and catch your breath and remember the bigger purpose.
Yeah, remembering the wins keeps us on track. And the thing that you also said, bringing e-commerce to a community in the year 2024, it seems like a no-brainer. But almost always social entrepreneurs who are looking to make an impact are thinking that it has to be some crazy big thing, when you could literally make a community millions of dollars by introducing technology and platforms that they're just not unaware of. For listeners who want to be social entrepreneurs and are looking to build organizations that will address global changes, what are some other tips you can give them to help them get started?
I think you just articulated that so well, that often we're looking for things that are bigger than they need to be. That sometimes the solutions, because we assume that things are being solved in this day and age for most things. And then there's often, really simple fixes to things. And the more complicated the fix, the harder it is to sustain. So in many ways, the easier you can make the problem, the better in terms of sustainability. So I think that's a big one. And I think, being able to think clearly through a problem down to what its root cause is and why and how you can solve for it, I think is really important. I think the other thing that's been really valuable for us is partnership. There is a lot already happening. And for Nest, we have certain skills, but we're not an e-commerce platform. We don't sell anything. And so we didn't try to build that technology for them. We didn't build them shops. What we looked and said, who's the best? Who has the most eyeballs on e-com for craft makers? Etsy's obvious. And so like we leaning on people and building partnership and being able to leverage what does already exist is super amazing. You don't have to eat the whole elephant. You can build coalitions and partnerships to help tackle things and make your piece of it feel a little easier.
The more something that I'm so always interested in is in branding. And I always want to hear the story of the entrepreneur and the business before I start asking about the names and the stuff they came up with. Having met you and having heard your story, the word nest, it's such a warm feeling in my heart. How did you come up with that?
I loved the idea of the nesting instinct, that we're like helping incubate fledgling businesses, but that ultimately they take off and fly, and it's an impermanent home. It's not a permanent dwelling. A nest isn't. And so how do we invest in helping people, make them feel safe, make them feel warm, make them feel cared for, but with the ultimate goal that they take off and fly. And maybe they can come back to the nest at some point and pick away some more twigs and other things, and we'll be there for some support, but that the ultimate goal is sustainability in flight. And that was the kind of vision of it. But I can't tell you in 18 years how many times people are like, oh, it's an acronym. What does it stand for? Like when we launched with the United Nations, our seal of ethical handcraft, everyone was like, nest doesn't mean anything. Why isn't it craft? Why isn't it handmade? So there's been lots of conversations about it. But to me, that feeling that you had, and this, like the kind of, it just draws me back every time I say it to what the original mission was. And hopefully once people know that, at least our staff and our partners and our artisans, it grounds us again in what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think it's a great name. What is the future for Nest? What is your biggest hope? Big, audacious, crazy, bold hope that you have?
And I think right now is one of the questions I'm really often asked is around like automation and robotics and technology. And I think one of the things what I've been loving is that as we've seen that increase, the more technologically connected we become, the more companies are switching to robotics and AI and all of these other things. The consumer demand for handcraft has been scaling at equal rates. So it's amazing to me that we're going to live in a parallel universe where it's like half robotic exotic made goods and then half completely handmade goods. But the human psyche wants that. It craves it. It craves that connection to people and to hands. And so companies know that. And so the more they like invest in technology, the more they build these parallel paths towards handmade. And so I think it's really exciting to see that the opportunity that we have in a technological world to sustain craft and handmade. And then I think there's also a lot of interest in like how those intersect eventually. And now I think that we see a lot of artists come to us that are integrating AI and technology. And I think it's uncharted territory, something as traditional as craft intersects with technology. And we're at the doorstep of that. And so I think we're super eager to be a part of those conversations and how they don't have to be necessarily parallel, but they can intersect in ways that feel meaningful and drive forward craft and don't inhibit it or diminish it in any way. And so I think that's the next frontier we're most excited about is making sure that we maintain that connection to the way things are made in spite of growing technology, and that we find ways for the two to intersect in healthy ways.
Almost always automation, engineering for the last 150 years, when it comes in and starts mass producing stuff, the cost of that item goes down. I can go to IKEA and buy myself a dining table for like $150, or I could go to a local Amish woodworker and buy a really beautiful handmade dining table for $4,000. Depends what place in life I am in. If I'm in college, you bet I'm going to IKEA, right? Almost always what we see is that when cheap, mass-produced, automated stuff comes up, handmade products, the way they make money is because it becomes more exclusive and more pricey. Do you think that is a possible direction this would go in, or do we really not know?
I think we don't know, but I think probably yes. I think that is a thing. I think what is interesting to me, though, is that a lot of the consumer trends are that you're that college student and you're buying that IKEA table, but you're also going on Etsy to buy all your wall hangings because you don't actually want your apartment to look like IKEA. And so you have like that's what I was talking about, these like kind of parallel competing fights that like those same consumers are also driving forward so much of the handmade market. And so it's really, but the middle ground is where I think there's like more struggle. Like it's either cheap and fast made or it's handmade. And most people, I would imagine most college students' apartments are probably a mix of those two. And so like, I don't know what that means for the future exactly. But I think one of the things I also like to share with people is that even when that's the case, I think I really like to encourage people to, like, we were talking about like small baby steps, set like certain things, buy every gift handmade. Like you don't have to do it for yourself. You don't have to do it for your like growing child who grows out of their clothes every 6 months. And you need Target makes a lot more sense for that. But can you give your holiday gifts that way? Can you give your birthday gifts that way? Find ways that you can invest in the handmade that meet your budget and where you are so that you're still participating and reflecting, but it doesn't have to be, we get into this like world of all or nothing, whereas like meaningful impacts can come from small steps.
Truly, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. On my wall there is a ship wheel that's from a 150-year-old ship that I found somewhere and I love it. And then those photos are from IKEA. There you go. Already living in the future in a balance somehow.
You are that college student.
Honestly, I still am. It drives my wife insane. In a world where everybody wants shortcuts, in a world where everybody wants to be an entrepreneur because they can quickly get a wad of cash that they can just fan in front of a rented airplane and take photos and put on Instagram. There are people like yourselves who are doing work at the grassroots level. And for someone like yourself, you could have done anything. You could still do anything new today. But the fact that you stick with something that is so meaningful, that has such deep cause, speaks volumes about the type of person you are. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that it is people like yourself who, through their work, really advance communities and society as a whole. So it's nothing but an honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you and get into the mind of somebody who's behind such a global push. What last words do you have for our audience, Rebecca?
Thank you. That is so kind. I'm like a little taken aback. That was really kind. Thank you. No, I think fight the good fight. You know what? Find your way to make your entrepreneurship niche, whether it's a whole company organization or within something. But I think all of those same values are super important for all of us to cultivate. It was so fun chatting with you today. Thanks for having me.
Here, thank you, and hope we talk soon again.